All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Yona Shushie Ehrenfeld, for dedicating the shurim in memory of Yosef ben Shmuel Aron. To thank Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, David and Malke Kramer, Lezecher nishmas Larisa Kanayeva. It's actually a pretty amazing dedication, who lived most of her life in the USSR, but lived her last years with her husband as a proud Jew in Baltimore. When her husband passed away before her, she would have been eligible for chalitza if it was not for the fact that all of her husband's siblings were killed in Babi Yar. Incredible, incredible. So we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of these precious neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a neshama. And with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Samech Daled. We are picking up on Samech Gimel Amud Beis, 63b. Really a lot to do today. So we are picking up in the wide lines, 3 lines in. So really towards the top of the daf. B'ma'arova, in Eretz Yisrael, kinosiv inish isisa. When a man would marry a woman, Amrile, they would say to him, Hachi, they would say to him the following, Matzah or Motza? So essentially they would ask him, how's it going? Right? How's it going? Matzah or Motza? What does it mean, Matzah or Motza? Matzah dichsev, Matzah isha, Matzah tov. Is the marriage going well in fulfillment of the pasuk that a man who has found a woman who has found is found good? Or Motza dichsev, umotze ani mar mimaves es ha'isha. Or is it Motza, right? Or Motze, which means, right, quoting the pasuk from Koheles, I found something more bitter than death, a wife, a reference to a bad marriage. So this is in Eretz Yisrael. They would say, is it Matzah or is it Motza? Amar Rava. Rava said, Isha Ra mitzvah legarsha. Rava says if a person is married to an Isha Ra, and again, both say we discussed what an Isha Ra is in yesterday's daf, there is a mitzvah to divorce her. Tichsev garash latz v'yatzam adon v'yishpos din v'kalon. Suppose that this in general is a fascinating idea. The idea that the Gemara telling us, and it's actually really quite profound, that as much as we speak about the integrity of marriage and the integrity of the home, there are certain times where perhaps marriage is so negative and so toxic and so corrosive that it may actually be preferable to end it than to sustain it. An interesting idea. So the Gemara says, what happens? Amarava Ishara Mitzvah. And again, I can't say enough. Remember, when we speak about Ishara, it's easy to say that the Gemara is going ahead and laying the blame for the toxicity of the marriage at the feet of the woman. But remember, again, we keep going back to yesterday's daf, where the Gemara told us that very often the nature and quality of a marriage is a reflection of the husband's spiritual standing. So we might be calling this Ishara, right? And again, seemingly blaming the woman for the dissolution of the marriage. But Lamaisa, we can't ignore the fact that Chazal themselves said, marriage, something's going bad in the marriage. Husband, take a look in the mirror. Where are you holding with your ruchnios? So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says as follows. What happens if halacha lamaisa, a person is married to an ishara, but she has a very expensive ksuva, which means he can't afford to divorce her. So tzarasa betzida. The Gemara says, ultimately, sometimes the most effective way is to marry another woman, which is an interesting eitzah. Right? In other words, marry another woman, because we'll say perhaps again the competition in the household will force the ishara to perhaps adopt a different approach in marriage. Da'armi inshi, because people say bechaverta v'lo besilsa. Sometimes you could accomplish more with her friend than with a thorn. The idea being that the thorn representing divorce, the friend representing a second life. Amarava, kasha ishara kiyom sagrir. A difficult wife is as difficult as a stormy day. Shin emar dalav tori biyom sagrir ve'eshes midin nishtave. Amarava, bo'u re'ei kamatova isha tova, the kamara ishara. So Rava says it's amazing the contrast. See how beneficial an isha tova, a good wife, is, and how difficult a difficult wife is. So listen to this, Rava said. So isha tov. I'm sorry. Bari kamara ishara. Kamatova isha tova. Dichsev matzah isha matzah tov. Rava said the pasuk says, as we've been quoting, a person finds an isha, he finds good. Now, Rava said, here's what's interesting. This is machlokes as to what the pasuk is referring to. Ibigava, if it refers to an actual wife, mishtoi kra kamatova ishatov, krai kamatova, ishatova shakasa mishabcha. So you see how good a good wife is, because the Torah itself, or the pasuk itself, right? But the pasuk itself is ultimately being mishabech, is praising her. Ibit Torah mishtoi. Now, we'll say, interestingly enough, some interpret the pasuk of matzah isha matzah tov to not be referring to a wife, but to be referring to Torah. And if it's referring to Torah, kama tova isha tova shatar nimshalaba. You see how profound having a good wife is, because Torah itself is compared to a good wife. So the Gemara says, Ishara, what about a Ishara? So the Gemara says, Dichsev umotza animar mimaves es ha'isha. Pasuk that we said before, I found something more bitter than death, a difficult wife. Ibigava mishtaikra. So ultimately, if the pasuk itself was actually referring to a wife, kamara ishara shakasav megana. So ultimately, again, you see the pasuk is pretty explicit about how negative a bad marriage is. Ibigehenam. And if it's referring to Gehenna, because I will say again, so you see this interesting machlokes, you see this opinion that says that the pasuk is referring not to a bad wife, but rather again, Ishara is really Gehenna, then Kama Ra Ishara, Shagehenna Nimshalaba, see how terrible a bad wife is, because Gehenna is compared to a bad marriage. So we'll say, see, either way, the idea that the Gemara is trying to highlight is, you see how much emphasis the psukim are putting on the quality of a marriage. That if a person is married to a good wife, a person has a good marriage, lemaisi, and that could be as sublime and as beautiful and as spiritual as Torah, and a person is locked in a bad marriage, that could be as terrible as Gehenna itself. So when the pasuk says, I'll bring upon you something terrible that you will not be able to emerge from, that could be a metaphorical reference to a bad marriage, but again with a very expensive ksuva. So the very expensive ksuva, the husband may not have the financial ability to extricate himself from that marriage. This is interesting. Others say in Eretz Yisrael, they said this is a pasuk that refers to someone who relies on money to buy his food. I was saying, what does that mean? So remember, this is a throwback to yesterday's daf, where the Gemara extolled someone who has land, right? The ability to be self-sufficient, at least in a food sense, right? To be self-sufficient in an agricultural sense, where you could go ahead and, take care of your own food. That's a big thing. That's a big thing. So the idea that someone who has to rely on his money, and therefore the fluctuation of prices and availability ultimately for food supply, so the Gemara calls that a certain level of klala. So I'll say, the pasuk says, your sons and your daughters will be given to another nation. This refers to a stepmother. That sometimes, again, if it's not the biological mother raising the children, but instead it's a stepmother, so sometimes the Gemara says there could be a roll of the dice who the father chooses to remarry, and whether or not that'll be a beneficial relationship for the children. Begay Naval Achiseim, Amrav Chanan Barava Amrav Zu Ishara Uksuva Samarubra. We'll say, keep coming back to this example of a difficult wife, a difficult marriage with a very expensive ksuva. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Elu Atzedukim. This refers to the Tzedukim. So we'll say again, according to the pasuk over here, Begay Naval Achiseim, literally again, I will agitate or anger Klal Yisrael with a foreign nation or a debased nation. Bechinu Omer Amanava Beliwa Ein Elokim. B'masnisatana Elu Anshe Barbaria Ve'elu Anshe Martinoi. So this refers to these nations. Shamahalchin Arumim Bashuk. They walk around naked in the marketplace. She'in Lecha Mashuk is obviously an unrefined, more barbaric type of people. She'in Lecha Mashuk Bashuk Aram. Apparently, again, it's considered to be amongst the most debased behaviors to walk around naked in the marketplace. Rabbi Yochanan says, Elu Chabarim. This refers to the Chabarim. I will say the Chabarim, Rashi says over here, are Parsi Misham. They are Persians. Wicked Persians, Rashi says, so the Chabarim apparently were like some group within the Persian people who were especially demeaning, dismissive, and oppressive of the Jewish people. So it's an interesting story. Amrli Rabbi Yochanan, Asu Chabar leBavel. Since Rabbi Yochanan, the Chabarim have come to Bavel. Shaga Nafal. Rabbi Yochanan, upon hearing this, kind of doubled over and fell down. Rashi says, Kafaf Natal Mirov Tsar. So he was so pained by the arrival of the Chabarim that he doubled over and fell down. Arule Mekabli Shochda. So he said to him, but good news, they can be bought off. Good news, right? You could bribe them. So Taritz Yosef, so he was able to sit up straight, right? In other words, the fact that they could be bribed was the source of neshama. Gazru al Gimel. Ultimately, the Chabarim came in and they made 3 decrees against the Jews. And Rabbi Yochanan understood Mipnei Gimel. The 3 decrees of the Chabarim corresponded to 3 areas of laxity of the Jewish people. Gazru ala Basar. So they very interesting. So they decreed on shchita. Isn't this fascinating? We think that decrees against shchita, right? Laws like banning shchita are new things. They're not new things, right? People's targeting ritual slaughter is an old practice. So ultimately, again, so they went ahead and they were gozer on shchita. So Rabbi Yochanan said, do you know why they were gozer on shchita? Got mipnei hamatanos. Because Jews were not careful to go ahead and give the matnos kahuna to Kohanim. Remember again, it's actually very interesting. We think about matnos kahuna as a function of karbanos. The truth is, technically speaking, whenever you shecht an animal, you're obligated to give the zroa, the lechaim, and the keva, the foreleg, right? The foreleg, the chest, and ultimately again, and the stomach to the kohen. That's matnos kahuna. It's matnos kahuna. No, I'm sorry, not the chest, the jaw, right? The jaw to the kohen. That's part of matnos kahuna. So Rabbi Yochanan felt that because we were lax with matnos kahuna, therefore again they were gozer on ritual slaughter as well. Gozer ala merchatzos. They ultimately said you can't go ahead and use the bathhouses mivnei tefillah because the Jews were lax with immersion in a mikvah. Kamechatete shachvi. They're exhuming dead bodies. Mipnei smechim biyom idam. This says because the Jews participated in the yamim tovim of the Goyim. Right? They were besimcha on the Yom Tovim of the Goyim. So because of that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them another day of Avelos. Because you must remember again, there's a halacha that if someone is buried and then exhumed, the relatives are obligated to observe Avelos on the day that the body is exhumed. This comes up, I'll just say just in halacha, this comes up with what we call likud atzamas. Let's say you want to transfer the grave. Whenever we bury someone today, we always tell the Avelim, bury with a t'nai, bury with the condition that if you want to move the grave at a later time, let's say you want to move the remains to Eretz Yisrael, you have the ability to do so. The day in which you go ahead and exhume those remains, ultimately there's a day of Avelos. So therefore, again, Rabbi Yochanan understood that halacha l'maisa, the Avelos, they were exhuming the dead because the Jews celebrated on the Yom Tovim of the Goyim. Shneimar, v'haisi el Hashem echem v'avasechem. Amar Rama bar Shmuel, Zu chatute shakvi, the Amar Mar, ba'avon chayim mesim mischatetin. Sometimes because of the sins of the living, the dead are exhumed. Amar li Rava l'Rab bar Mari, ksiv. So we'll say the Gemara quotes the pasuk here. Quotes the pasuk from Yirmiyahu, and the pasuk says, all right, lo yasfu v'lo yikaberu l'domina pnei adam hayiyu. Literally, again, they will not be collected, they will not be buried in silence on the earth. V'ksiv v'nivchar maves mechayim. So we'll say, the Gemara feels the psukim are contradicting each other, because one pasuk seems to indicate that death is a peaceful relief, and the other pasuk says that it's not. Amalei. So the Gemara says, which one is it? Nivchar maves l'rishayim shlo yichyu ba'olam hazeh. It's referring to the Rishaim that for the wicked, death is better than life in this world, because at least in death, they cannot make terrible mistakes. Kasav b'Sefer ben Sira. It says in Sefer ben Sira, Isha tova matana tova labayla. A good wife is a great gift, is an incredible gift for her husband. Uksiv tova b'cheikirei elokim tinasim. Isha ra Tsara'as labayla. We'll say first of the widest lines on the bottom. Anishara, a bad wife, is like tsara'as for her husband. My takante, so what's the takana, what's the remedy? Yigashena v'yisrape mitzaraso. Divorce her and be healed ultimately from the tzaras. I will say, so once again, I can't say enough, you have all of these competing themes. Our Gemara seem, you could walk away with the impression that if the marriage is in a state of disrepair, it's the wife. But remember again, we keep going back to yesterday's Gemara, where dysfunction in a marriage is often reflective of a husband's state of spiritual disrepair, right? What Chazal are telling us is that sometimes marriages can't be fixed, right? I will say, unlike other religions where divorce is a sin, right? Judaism is very much against divorce, to be very clear, very much against divorce, right? The Gemara Maseches Gittin, the Mizbeach is morid mos, right? The Mizbeach cries when a Jewish couple gets divorced. But sometimes certain relationships cannot be fixed. It's just a fact. It's just a fact. So you see Chazal indicating that sometimes divorce is the answer. But again, I will say that's only after all other options have been exhausted. All other options have been exhausted. So the Gemara goes right to Isha Yafa Ashrei Baila Mispar Yamav Kflaim. So this is actually a beautiful Gemara. If a man is zocheh to be married to a beautiful woman, and again I will say the Pashut Pshat is that it's referring to her physical beauty. He's zocheh to be married to a beautiful woman. Mispar Yamav Kflaim. It's like he has. I will say it's like the days of his life have been doubled. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, we'll say, if a man is privileged to be married to a beautiful woman, ultimately, again, he's samech bechelko. He's happy with what he has. It's such a beautiful Gemara. He's happy with what he has. And when a person is happy with what he has, then at the end of the day, he feels like his life has been prolonged. Literally, I will say, shield your eyes from a woman of beauty. I will say, this is referring to someone else's wife. Don't look at someone else's wife. Lest you be caught in her trap. Now, I will say, now again, to be clear, this is not saying avoid looking at someone else's wife because she's going to entice you. It means don't look at someone else's wife because you're going to become enticed because we're human beings. I will say, this is so incredibly important that Chazal are teaching us, sometimes we like to think that we're above certain temptations. People, we're all human beings. No one is above or beyond any temptation. And when we get ourselves into trouble is when we think that we're beyond temptation. Gemara says, don't look at other people's wives. Don't look at other people's wives, lest you go ahead and get ensnared in immorality. So the Gemara goes right there. So, al tat eitzel bala, Limsoch imo yayin v'sheichar ki betoar yafa ishar yafa rabim chushtasu vatsum kol harageh. And I will say, if there is a woman that you find attractive, someone else's wife, don't start drinking l'chaims with her husband, because again, that closeness to her husband ultimately could lead to closeness to the wife, and that could get one into all kinds. I will say, an incredible use. So you know what Chazal are teaching us? A person has to be careful with socialization as well. Person has to be careful with socialization, because even sometimes what begins as innocent socialization could lead to immoral behavior. A person has to be on guard with immorality, especially in a situation where a person finds another man's wife attractive. Such an incredible yesod. Rabim hayu pitzei rochal hamargim l'dvar avera. So literally again, many have found themselves pitzei rochal, receiving the punches of the spice salesman. I will say the idea being over here, it's interesting. Apparently, like spice peddlers or perfume peddlers were often known to be immoral. Why is that? Because to this, who are they selling spices and perfume to? Women. So they were often constantly interacting with women, and therefore sometimes they got themselves into a little bit of trouble. Knitzutz ma'aver gacheles. I will say this is so profound. Sometimes there's like a spark that ignites the coal. See, Rabbi say, when it comes to matters of immorality, so sometimes it's the smallest spark that ignites a fire of immorality. I'll say that's the yesod something with arayas. That sometimes things that begin in an innocent way and things that begin in a non-immoral way, not an illicit way, but sometimes the smallest spark could lead to the flame of immoral behavior. Kikalov maleof. Sometimes, again, just like the coop is filled with chickens or birds, sometimes life is filled with immoral opportunities. So we'll say, so again, that's the Gemara. We'll say, we've seen this theme and motif a number of times throughout our journeys in Shas. that when it comes to matters of morality, how careful we have to be to set up the right gidarim, the right boundaries. Because I will say sometimes, again, we make the fatal mistake of thinking that we are impervious to certain wants and desires and certain things. I would never do that. I will say, in life, there's pretty much nothing we would never do given the opportunity. And if we think that we wouldn't do certain things, it's often only because we're a bit delusional and think that we're stronger than we really are. But live life as if you're really not beyond any temptation. And therefore, if a person lives life like that, they create the right gidarm, the right protective fences for themselves. A beautiful Gemara. Al tatzar, I'll say this is an underliner. Al tatzar tzaras machar. Don't worry about what may happen tomorrow. Kilo teda mayolad yom. Because tomorrow, you don't even know what today's going to bring. Shema machar ba ve'einonen nimsa. Right? Because tomorrow may come and you may not even be here. Nimsa mitzta'ar ala olam she'in shalo. And it turns out that you're worrying about a world that is not even yours. You'll say, what a profound Gemara. What a profound Gemara, right? Unlike the famous Ma'amar Chazal that says, don't stop thinking about tomorrow, right? So apparently, again, that is incorrect. Stop thinking about tomorrow. The Gemara says, what are you worrying about tomorrow for? Right? What are you worrying about tomorrow? Worrying about tomorrow presupposes you have a tomorrow. Not to sound morose, but no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So what Chazal is really saying is like this. Instead of using all of your energy worrying about tomorrow, focus on maximizing today. Because today is what you have, right? Today is what you have. That's biyadcha. Tomorrow, you have no idea what's going to happen. And so many times in life, people worry about a future that they may or may not have. Nimtza mitzta'ir ala olam she'in shalo. It turns out you're worrying about a world that may or may not be yours. Today is yours. Now we'll say, it doesn't mean that Chazal are telling us not to engage in future planning. Of course you have to engage in future planning, but what Chazal are telling us is that so often we wrap up so much of our emotional energy and resources worrying about the future and worrying about tomorrow that we forget to maximize today. Incredible. So mana rabim mitoch beisecha v'lo hakol tavi beisecha. We'll say, so listen, interesting. So count many amongst the members of your home, but don't allow everyone into your home. We'll say, isn't that an incredible yesod? Chazal telling us, have an open house, and be the kind of person who's able to interact with many, but be very careful what influences you do allow into your home. I was supposed to say, such an incredible yesod. Don't just allow anyone or anything into your home. There's got to be a filter installed in the home. You don't say there's a filter for what I allow inside of my home. The Gemara goes on, Rabbi Darshe Shlomecha. Ultimately, again, I will say there should be many people who ask about you. In other words, be the kind of person who is necessary and impactful for the masses. Gala sod la'achad me'elef. But only reveal your secrets to 1 out of 1,000 people. I will say, in other words, this is a good way to live life. Assume most people cannot maintain confidentiality, right? And that's absolutely 99% of people will not maintain confidentiality. So therefore, again, you have to have someone who you could share your secrets with, but usually that person is 1 out of 1,000. Amr Rabbi Asi, Ein Bein David Ba, Ad Shichlu Kol Neshama Shebeguf. We saw this Gemara yesterday. The Mashiach only comes once all of the neshamas are emptied out of that chamber called the Guf. Shen Emar Kiruach Milafana Yatov and Neshamas Ani Asisi. Tanya Rabbi Lezer Omer. Kol Mi She'ein Osek. Back to Peri Verivia. It's supposed to be incredible, right? Incredible Gemaras. All of these Gemaras are incredible. Back to Peri Verivia. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol Mi She'ein Osek Peri Verivia Kilu Shofech Damim. Whoever is not engaged in the mitzvah Peri Verivia, it's as if he's spilling blood. Rabbi say, once again, I keep going back to the idea, you see that whenever Chazal speak up Peri Verivia, what do they say? Osek. Because this goes back to what we started with on Sunday, which is, what's the mitzvah Peri Verivia? What's the mitzvah? Iskos. It's to try to have children, right? Whether or not I have children, that's up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gemara is saying, if a person doesn't try, it's as if he shofech dam, as if he spills blood. Shnei Amar, shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishapech. What's the pasuk in Bereshis? Person kills someone, his blood will be spilled. And it says right after this Parshas Noach, it says right afterwards, V'atem peru uravu. So the juxtaposition to the mitzvah perverivia to shofech dama adam ba'adam tells me that if I don't try to have children, it's as if I'm spilling blood. Rabbi Yaakov Omer kilu mema'it hadmus. It's actually beautiful. If a person doesn't try to have children, it's as if they're diminishing the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? Because every single person is at Salam Elokim. The more people there are, interestingly enough, the more manifest, almost the more presence of the divine exists in the world. So a person doesn't try to bring more presence of divinity into the world. It's as if they're mema'it HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Incredible. Shneimar ki b'tzelem Elokim asa adam u'ksiv basrei v'atem peru. Ben Azai says about this is incredible. Ben Azai says, Kilu shofech damim umema'it hadmos. Shneimar v'atem peru. So Ben Azai says it's both. If a person doesn't try to have children, so ultimately it's as if he's spilling blood and as if he's diminishing the presence of Hashem in this world. Now, let's say, get ready for this Gemara. Amrulola Ben Azai. So Ben Azai says this in the base medrash, and they say to Ben Azai, Ben Azai, yesh no'ed doresh v'no'ed mekayim. There are some people who know how to darshan well, they know how to teach Torah well, and they also fulfill that which they teach. They practice what they preach. Some people who practice in the right way, right? They live the right lives, but they're not necessarily effective or impactful teachers. V'yata, you Ben Azai, no'e dorish ve'ein no'e mekayim. You Ben Azai, you're a wonderful teacher, but you don't practice what you preach. I will say, Ben Azai was single. Ben Azai was single. He did not marry. So Ben Azai, you're just telling us all now that if you don't try to engage in perverivia, it's like shofech dam, you spilling blood, and memai tadmus, you diminish the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ben Azai, you're not doresh ve'ino mekayim. Beautiful, great drasha, great cheer. But lamaisi not practicing what you're preaching. Let's see, look how beautiful this is. Ben Azai, ma'aseh. Ben Azai says, what do you want from me? Shenafshi chashka baTorah. I'm in love with Torah, and I'm consumed with Torah, and I don't have the bandwidth for any other relationship. Absolutely incredible. So the Gemara says, "Efshali olam sheyiskayim al yedei acherim." Ultimately, again, my role is to learn. The world will be built up through other people. I will say absolutely overwhelming Gemara. If you look at Tosas, in just a moment, Tosas says, "Sheyiskayim al yedei acherim afa gav nasha parak afa pi shenasa bital sherabi Akiva tikamar sabar sherabi Akiva of the little Ben Azai." So I will say, listen to this. Here's the problem. You have an alternate Gemara in Ksubis that says Ben Azai did marry. Who did he marry? He married the daughter of Rabbi Akiva. To which, so how do you reconcile this with this Gemara? To which the Gemara says, Dinasa v'giresh. It must be he married her, but then he subsequently divorced her. And therefore, again, our pasuk is once again when Ben Azai is single. So Rabbi say, this is a fascinating Gemara because it creates this model of, not paradigm, but model of nafshi chashka b'Torah. And nafshi chashka b'Torah means someone who is so consumed with Torah that Torah almost becomes his spouse, right? Torah becomes his relationship. This is a being fully consumed with Torah. I will tell you, interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way. And the Shulchan Aruch says that if someone is like a Ben Azai, where nafsho chashka b'Torah, he does not have an obligation of peri verivia. Then I will say, obviously, that threshold, I think it's kind of unimaginable. It's not talking about a guy like who's learning in Kolo, right? This is not talking about a guy who, learns morning Seder and afternoon Seder, has a chavrus at night. This is a person whose entire life is consumed by Torah. I don't know how many other people like Ben Azai there are like that, but Lamais, and someone who feels that he doesn't have room because of Torah, doesn't have room in his life for any other relationship. The Shulchan Aruch says there is such a patur like this, is such an exemption for Rivya, the Ben Azai exemption. But say just absolutely incredible. Okay, let's go back there. Says the Gemara. Good. So Tanya Idach, Rabbi Lazar Omer Kol Mi She'eino Oseh Peri V'Rivya Kilu Shofech Dam Shneimar Shofech Dam Adam Sobach Le'atem Peru. Rabbi Lazar Ben Azai Omer Kilu Mai Tatmus Ben Azai Omer Amnu Ben Azai Yesh Nadash. Good. Rabbi say same exchange. Tan Rabbanon. We'll say the last line, Samach Kibul days. Tanabana, Uvenucha Yomar, Shuva Hashem Rivos Alpha Yisrael. So we'll say the pasuk says when the Aron would come to a stop, they would say, Shuva Hashem Rivos Alpha Yisrael. Malame Tap of Samach Dalit. We'll say this teaches us a very important yesod. Shena Shechina Shora Al Pachos Mishnei Alaf Mishnei Rivavos. We'll say in order for the Shechina to rest on Klal Yisrael, there must be at least 22,000 Jews. There has to be in existence at least 22,000 Jews for Cheshach Baruch Hu to rest upon Klal Yisrael. We'll say that's ultimately again Alpha. So Shuv Hashem Rivavos Alpha Yisrael. So why is this important? Harei Shahal Yisrael Shnei Alaf Mushnei Rivavos Chaser Echad V'Zel Asak B'Peri V'Rivya. So we'll say the Gemara is just giving an extreme example. What does it mean if someone is not osik beperi v'rivya? Someone doesn't try to have a family, that they're memayit hadmus, that they diminish the divine presence in the world? Because you could have it's a bit of an exaggerated case, but let's say, assuming we accept this premise, you could have you need 22,000 Jews in order for the Shekhinah to rest upon Klal Yisrael. And now what happens? Let's assume for a moment there's 22,000 minus one. And then Ruvain, who could have been Osek B'Peri V'Rivya, doesn't have a child. It turns out that he's literally being Memait Hadamus. Okay? So the Gemara says, Eliezer Chayiv Misa. If a person doesn't try to have children, he's Chayiv Misa. Shneimar Ubanim Lo Hayu Lahem. Nadav and Avihu. When the Torah recounts again their death, the Torah adds in this phrase, they didn't have children. So there is a school of thought that Nadav and Avihu were held accountable because they never tried to establish families. You can infer from this, had they had children, they would not have died. Person who doesn't try to engage in Peri V'Rivya causes the Shekhinah to depart from Klal Yisrael. Shneimar, Lios L'chal Elokim Ulazaracha Acharecha. Bizman shezaracha acharecha, when you have offspring after you, Shechina Shora, then the Shechina is with us. Ein zaracha acharecha, if there is no offspring after you, so Ami Shora, who is the Shechina going to reside upon? Ala itzim v'ala abonim, on the trees and on the stones, and therefore again one is obligated to engage in Peri V'Rivya. So we'll say this concludes the sugya. Actually, I take it back. It does not conclude the sugya. We have one more piece. But this concludes the first part of the sugya of Peri V'Rivya. And again, I will say, obviously we're doing it quickly because it's Daf Yomi, but Lamaisa, I would urge you, go back and chazer these dapim, because besides that, there's incredible halacha. Again, I will say, if you want to see the whole Peri V'Rivya, once again, Even HaEzer, Siman Aleph. It's all in there. You'll find all of these halachas. And again, the beautiful hashkafa associated with Peri V'Rivya as well as the definition that I will say Peri V'Rivya is not the mitzvah to have children. The mitzvah Peri V'Rivya is the mitzvah to try to have children. And as long as one is trying, ultimately they're fulfilling the mitzvah. The difference is once you have, we paskin like Beis Hillel, a boy and a girl, you're allowed to stop trying. However, even after you fulfill the technical mitzvah Peri V'Rivya, we've also established that there is an additional mitzvah of Sheves, which is general population of the world, which is non-gender specific, which halakha l'maisa requires a person to try to keep having children. Obviously, we'll say the halachas in terms of is a person at a certain point in time allowed to stop trying to have children. Again, those are all additional sugyas that are beyond the scope of our Gemara right now. Let's go weiter. Says in the Mishnah, Nasa isha v'sha ima eser shanim v'lo yolda. If a man is married to a woman and they're married for 10 years and they are unsuccessful in having children, Eino Rashay Levato. The most Eino Rashay Levato means a husband has to fulfill the mitzvah Peri V'Rivya. Remember again, the mitzvah Peri V'Rivya is on the man, it is not on the wife. So if a husband has been married for 10 years, that's the duration, they don't have children, he has to find an alternate solution to have children. So I will say, so what are the alternate solutions? So Rashi points out, he could either divorce his wife, right, or he can marry another woman. So the Gemara says, Girsha, if he divorces his wife, mutares li nase la'achar. She is permitted to marry another man. Now, both say, now what does that mean? See, when the Gemara understands, the Mishnah understands as follows, that halacha l'maisa, if a couple is childless for 10 years, what the Mishnah is saying is, we don't know who the challenge resides in. In other words, who has the issue, who has the fertility issue. So therefore, again, I will say, the Mishnah phrases it that the husband is obligated to take action because the husband has the mitzvah Peri V'Rivya. But we don't assume that it's the woman who has the fertility issue. Because and therefore, again, upon divorce, she can get remarried. And who could she get remarried to? In other words, anyone. In other words, she can get remarried after 10 years of her first marriage to a man who all says them is a pervert. We don't assume that the fertility issue is hers, so she can get remarried. And when she gets remarried, ultimately, again, I will say, and the second husband also has the same 10-year window with this wife. So I will say, interesting enough, so if they don't have children, husband has to fulfill his mitzvah, so has to do something, but we don't automatically assume that the issue is hers. Therefore, she's permitted to go in and get remarried as well. Give me pila. What if a woman was pregnant and then miscarried? So mona misha shepila. The 10-year clock begins from the miscarriage. In other words, this is actually interesting. In other words, if a woman is pregnant and miscarries, we don't say that a miscarriage is the equivalent to no pregnancy. So therefore, the 10-year clock begins from the time of the miscarriage. Says, say an incredible Gemara, if a man was married to a woman and they were married for 10 years, fulo yolda, and they just didn't have children, Yotzi, so he's obligated to divorce her. Now, as we saw, you don't have to divorce her, you could also marry another wife, but Lamaisa, he is obligated to do something to allow for his fulfillment of perverivya. V'yitain ksuva, and he has to pay her ksuva. Now, obviously he has to pay her ksuva, because Lamaisa, we don't assume that halacha Lamaisa, the inability to have children is because of her. Shema lo zacha lihibanos mimena. So I'll say, because once again, we don't, because perhaps it was him. I was going to say, perhaps it's his zechus that doesn't allow for children. In other words, the Rebbe said we don't penalize her in any way, because it's just as possible or probable that it's an issue with him. Shema, the Rebbe said, lashon of Shema lo zacha. Maybe he did not merit to have children with this woman. We'll say, even though, again, we don't have a raya. We'll say raya means I don't have a pasuk, like a mitzvah, like a halacha to support this, but we have an illusion. We'll say, what's the scriptural illusion? Listen to this. Miketz eser shana l'shaves Avram ba'aretz Canaan. So we'll say, remember again, the pasuk says, 10 years after Avram and Sarai came to Canaan, what happened? Avram married Hagar. He took an additional wife. Let's say, so interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Lilamdecha she'ein yeshivas chutz la'aretz ola lo min haminyan. Rabbi say this is wild. In the 10-year infertility clock, so living in chutz la'aretz doesn't count towards the 10 years. Why doesn't living in chutz la'aretz count? Look at Rashi. This is absolutely incredible. Rashi says, Miketz eser shanim bal Hagar v'hadlo nasiv la b'hanech shani kamay achlo bal aretz Canaan shehu shanim merubos b'padan aram ladecha she'ein yeshivas chutz la'aretz olalo. I will say, if you're living in chutz la'aretz, the 10 years don't count. Why? Dilma mishum avon chutz la'aretz heim akurim. Maybe it's because of the sin of living in chutz la'aretz. Maybe that's why they're infertile. Wow. Let's say, what an overwhelming Gemara. First of all, Rashi calls it the sin of living in chutz la'aretz, which is a very, very, very overwhelming and strong lashon. And I will say, even if you want to say, not everybody agrees, right? There's different opinions. I will say, the fact that Rashi even floats that phrase, the sin of living in chutz la'aretz, that maybe that's the reason they don't have children. So I will say, this is actually fascinating, because what Rashi is driving it as follows. Why didn't Avraham marry Hagar, or marry someone, right, in Padan Aram? Right, Avraham and Sarah were married for many years before they came to Canaan. And obviously they're not blessed with children all of those years. So the Gemara understands, because halacha l'maisa, this idea of the 10-year infertility clock doesn't apply in chutz la'aretz, because in chutz la'aretz, what the Gemara is saying is, there's another mitigating factor, or there's another factor that may be causing infertility, which is the chait, the sin of living in chutz la'aretz. So I'll say, so profound. I saw last night brought down that often, it's incredible, I never heard this before, that when couples would come to Reb Chaim, when men would come to Reb Chaim, right, Reb Chaim Zecher Tzadik v'Kadosh Livracha, and speak about the fact that they didn't have children, Reb Chaim would ask them if they live in Eretz Yisrael. And if they said no, Reb Chaim would suggest for them to come and live in Eretz Yisrael. And he quoted this Gemara, that perhaps, again, the source of the infertility is the chait of living in chutz la'aretz, which I will say is incredibly. So again, Yeah, Reb Chaim literally dispensed eitzah based on this. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Lefichach, chalahu o shechal sehi. Sefer Rabosai again. What this also tells us says as follows: if he is sick or she is sick, or shneim chavushim es asurim, or they're both incarcerated, in which case obviously they're separated. Ein onulam and aminyan. So what you see from here is the same way that halacha lemaisa, living in chutz la'aretz creates a mitigating factor. Ultimately, again, that doesn't start the 10-year clock. So too, if there are other mitigating factors. Let's say he's sick and therefore can't engage in relations. She's sick, can't engage in relations. They're incarcerated, can't engage in relations. So halacha l'maisa, if there are any other mitigating factors, the 10-year clock doesn't start. So Amalei Rav Nachman, v'leilef mi Yitzchak, t'chsiv ahi Yitzchak ben 40 shanim b'kachlas Rivka, o ksiv Yitzchak ben 6 shanim b'ledes Osam. I don't understand. Why didn't you learn out a different paradigm from Yitzchak? Rabbi say Yitzchak was 40 when he got married and was only 60 when he had kids. So maybe that should teach us that you have a 20-year window, right? You're learning out from Avram Avinu that it's a 10-year window, right? Avram Avinu waited 10 years from the time that he arrived in Canaan until he went and he took Hagar. Why don't you learn out a 20-year window from Yitzchak, right? Yitzchak was married 20 years before he had kids. So maybe you're allowed to wait 20 years. So the Gemara says, Amalei Yitzchak akar haya. No, it came right from Yitzchak. Yitzchak was sterile. Yitzchak wasn't able really, b'derech hateva, to have children. If that's the case, Ihachi, Avraham nami akar haya. This is wild. Avraham Avinu was also sterile. Again, we'll discuss where the Gemara gets this from. To which the Gemara says, no. But I need the pasuk by Yitzchak for a different reason. Why the years of Yishmael counted? Ultimately, in order to give us lifespan of Yaakov. That's why the pasuk brings down the years by Yitzchak, because it's the years of Yitzchak that give us the tally of everyone else's lifespans as well. Rabbi Yitzchak Avinu akar haya. Yitzchak was sterile. How do the Yitzchak was sterile? Shene'emar vayetar Hashem lenochach Yitzchak. I'm sorry. Vayetar Yitzchak laHashem lenochach ishto. So I said the pasuk is very important. Vayetar Yitzchak laHashem, which means Yitzchak. Yetar means supplicated. He davened to Hashem lenochach ishto. Rabbi say lenochach ishto literally means opposite his wife. So al ishto lo ne'emar. It doesn't say that Yitzchak davened to Hashem for his wife. Rather, again, ela lenochach. Rabbi say what the Gemara understands where nochach means some level of what? Almost like equality, right? He was on the same level as Rivka, meaning what? That just as Rivka was infertile, so too was Yitzchak. So the Gemara says, Melamed sheshnehem akurim hayu. They were both sterile. They were both infertile. Ihachi vaye'etar lo vaye'etar lahemi ba'ile. If that's the case, then why does it say that Hashem answered Yitzchak? Vaye'etar lo. Right? It should say vaye'etar lahem. He answered them, because remember again, they're both in need of the salvation of Hashem. It was an incredible Gemara. Tfilas tzadik ben tzadik, the tfilas tzadik ben rasha. Because it was you cannot compare the tefillah ultimately of a tzadik ben tzadik to a tzaddik ben rasha. Yitzchak Avinu is Yitzchak ben Avram. The tefillah of a tzaddik ben tzaddik, and the tefillah of a tzaddik ben tzaddik is more powerful than the tefillah of a tzaddik ben rasha. Rivka was a tzaddikes, but she was the daughter of a rasha. I will say incredible. That's why it's Yitzchak Avinu's tefillos that carry the day. I'm Rabbi Yitzchak. I will say profound Gemara. Mipnei ma hayu avasin hakura. I will say why? What a strange Gemara. Avraham sterile. Yitzchak is sterile. Rivka sterile. By the way, we're going to Sarah's also. What's the pshat? What's the pshat? Why? Mipnei she'akadosh baruch hu mis'ave letfilasan shal tzadikim. Ultimately, again, because Hashem desires the tfilos of tzaddikim. Now I will say, this is a famous Gemara, right? Every kid learns this Gemara in school, and I will tell you, at least personally, I've always found this Gemara to be so incredibly troubling. So you're telling me that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives a person adversity and difficulty because he loves them, right? He loves their tfilos. He wants them to daven, he wants their tfilos so bad, therefore he gives them adversity. It sounds strange. It sounds strange. It's like going over to my child, taking away my child's favorite toy, right? Taking it away because I love it when they come to me and they ask me for stuff, Right? Well, what's the pshat? So I will say, continue on in the Gemara. I'm Rabbi Yitzchak. Lema nimshul tfilas and shal tzadikim. Or excuse me, lama nimshul tfilas and shal tzadikim ke'eter. So I will say, remember again, the lashon of tefillah that's used over here is vaye'etar. So I will say, Rashi points out that vaye'etar is a lashon of like, for lack of a better term, like being persistent. Being a nudnik, not just davening once, but keeping on davening and davening and davening and davening until you get what you want. I will say etar also means a pitchfork. So why the tefillos of tzaddikim compared to a pitchfork? Ma etar zeh mahapechat vo mimakom lamakom. But say, what do you do with a pitchfork? Everyone knows what do you do with a pitchfork. You take the straw, you lift it up, and you move it from location A to location B. Rabbi say the tefillah of tzaddikim is as powerful as a pitchfork. Meaning what? Kach tefillah shal tzaddikim mehapeches midosav shal Kadosh Baruch Hu memidas ragzonos lemidas rachmanos. Rabbi say the power of the tefillah of a tzaddik is like the power of a pitchfork. Pitchfork takes things from one spot to another. So to the tefillahs of the tzaddikim have the ability to move HaKadosh Baruch Hu, have the ability to cause God to change from the divine attribute of strict justice to the divine attribute of mercy. I will say that's the pshat. When it says that Hashem loves the tefillos of tzaddikim, it doesn't mean that Hashem gives people suffering because He wants them there, because He loves their tefillos. First of all, that sounds very self-centered, right? And incredibly just self-serving. What it means is HaKadosh Baruch Hu used the avos and the ma'os as the vehicle to teach us the power of prayer. The koach hatfila. Rabbi will say, what can you accomplish with the koach hatfila like a pitchfork? Tefillah has the ability to change things. It even has the ability, kiviyachol, to change God. Not literally to change God, but to cause God to move from the midah of din to the midah of rachmanos. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu leveled such adversity at the avos and the mos, because He wanted them to show all future generations that with the koach hatfilah you can affect change, and you could affect dramatic change. And no matter how adverse your circumstances may be, no one and nothing is beyond salvation and transformative cathartic change. The avos and the mos are akaros. They're sterile. There is no possible way in the natural world that they could have children. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them these circumstances, not because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was waiting there for us to daven, because He wants us to show, He wants them to show the world, show people. Tefillah is not just a mechanistic behavior. It's not just something you engage in to check the box. Tefillah changes people. Tefillah changes the world. Tefillah changes the laws of nature. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu leveled against them these dramatic circumstances. And I will say that's the power of the circumstance of the Avos and Emos. Incredible. Avraham and Sarah mutmatin hayu. I will say again, the Gemara is a bit hyperbolic over here. It says, well, they were tumtum. I will say, no, tumtum means that there's like a membrane covering the sexual organ. So I will say, so once again, the Maharsha brings it out, it doesn't be understood literally. It's trying to highlight the fact that there was no possible way in the natural world that these people should have had children, right? There was no possible way. So the Gemara says, "Shneimar abitu al tzorch chutzavtem amud beis v'amakavas bor nukrasem uksiv habitu al avram avichem ve'al tochalchem." Amar Nachem Amar Baravua Saremenu islandess haisa. Saremenu was an islandess. So I will say again, islandess once again means a woman without a uterus, right? Once again, no possible. Shneimar vati Sarah akara. Ein la valad. Pasuk says Sarah was an akara, right? She was sterile. She didn't have children. Afilu beis vlad ein la. She didn't even have a beis vlad, right? She didn't even have a uterus. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Breider Shmuel bar Shilas b'shrei Rav lo shana. So we'll say so again. So that's the Gemara. So therefore, we'll say let's just take a step back for just a moment. Our Mishnah taught us. We'll say first of all, again, I can't say enough. I feel bad that we don't have enough time to do justice to a lot of these Gemaras. But I will say the Gemara we just learned about Tefillah is so important, and I think it's the correct understanding of the Gemara, because the notion that HaKadosh Baruch Hu just makes people suffer because He likes their tefillos, He likes the tefillos of the righteous. That's not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's not a Ribono Shel Olam who loves us. But they see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu visits difficult circumstances on people because He wants them to see and wants others to see the transformative power of prayer, because that's a benefit for the rabbin. Suddenly, again, I see I could change my circumstances through tefillah. We'll say, let's go back to the beginning. Remember, the Mishnah taught us that there's a 10-year fertility window, we'll call it. A person is married. If after 10 years they don't have children, then a husband has to take action in order to be able to have children. Okay, so let's say we then saw, where does the 10-year window come from? Avram and Sarah. That when they come to Eretz Yisrael, 10 years before Avram Avinu marries Hagar. Okay, then we'll say, listen to this. Back to that topic. So the Gemara says, so Amar Rav Yehuda Breid Rav Shmuel Bar Shil Soshed Rav Lo Shana B'Dal Sarshon Shnasei Merubos. The 10-year window, that was only said in earlier generations where they had longer lifespans. Aval b'doros achronim, but our contemporary time, sheshnosen mu'atos, where we live shorter lives. Shtei shlemu mechza, right? Ultimately, again, it's not 10 years, but rather, what is it? 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Then we'll say, now what's 2.5 years? Kineged shalosh shiburim. 2.5 years represents 3 pregnancies. 3 pregnancies. Rabba Amar Rav Nachman, shalosh shanim. 3 years is the window. Keneged shalosh pekidos. The boss is incredible because 3 years you get 3 Rosh Hashanahs, right? 3 Rosh Hashanah, right? 3 New Years. What's significant about Rosh Hashanah? Damar Rosh Hashanah nifkidu Sarah Rachel v'Chana. Because we'll say ultimately again, Rosh Hashanah is the day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembered barren women. It's the day that Sarah, Rachel, and Chana were remembered for pregnancy. So they both say, so therefore again, you see a dramatic machlokes here. So whereas the Mishnah says 10 years, now this other school of thought says 10 years was once upon a time, when people lived for very long times. Now it's a diminished window, 2.5 years, 3 years. Samar Rabba, listen lahani klali. Rabba says, no, that's incorrect. The window is still 10 years. Michti, I'll tell you why. Michti, Masnisin man talking. Rabbi say ultimately again, who arranged the Mishnah first white line? Rebbe. Vahabi made David imat shani. Rabbi say way before Rebbe, in the days of David Amalek, lifespans were already diminished. Dechsiv yemesh no sinobam shivim shana, so vim bigvuros shmonim shana. David Amalek already said lifespans are 70 years. At most, you get 80 years. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, halacha l'maisa, when Rebbe codified the Mishnah, that was already reflecting the idea that lifespans are diminished, yet Rebbe still codified a 10-year fertility window. It says, the Gemara, second line, v'hai, shema lo zacha lihibanos himena, v'dilma ihi dilo zachya. I will say it's interesting, because the lashon of the Mishnah was, perhaps it's the man, or the Gemara was, perhaps it's the man who has not been privileged to go ahead and be built up through this woman. So the Gemara seems to say that perhaps the fertility issue belongs to the man. So the Gemara said, well, why don't we entertain the possibility that the fertility issue belongs to the woman? Maybe it's her issue. Well, this is actually fascinating. So the Gemara says, Ihi kevan de lo mefakta perivarivya lo ma'ansha. So we'll say, this is fascinating, from a hashkafic perspective, because a woman does not have a mitzvah of perivarivya, if it's going to be withheld from one of them, it's going to be withheld from the man and not from the woman. In other words, the inability to have children, the Gemara said, might be more of a reflection of a spiritual issue, at least with the man than with the woman, since it's his mitzvah and not hers. Fascinating. Ini, is that so? Yet the rabbi said to Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, Nasiv Isesa va'olid. Apparently Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda wasn't married at the time. He was married before, he wasn't married at the time. So they said to Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, you have to get married and have kids. Va'amr lahu, izakai havuli mikamaisa. So Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda said, if I would have married, apparently he was married. If I would have had, right, if I would have merited, I would have had children from my first wife. So the Gemara says, Hasam dachui kamat rabbanan. In truth, Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda was kind of just trying to deflect what the Rabbanan were saying. Why? Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda i'aker mi pirkei de Rav Huna. We're back to Rav Huna's shir, right? The very long shir. Right? So ultimately he became sterile as a result of Rav Huna's shir. I will say again, this goes back to Sunday's daf, where we saw again these great Rabbanim. Rav Huna gave apparently a very long shir. No one wanted to interrupt the shir by leaving to go to the bathroom. And as a result of holding it in for a long time, so the Gemara attributes their sterility to going ahead and holding back their urine. So the Gemara says, Rav Gidl iyakim perkei de Rav Huna, right? Rav Gidl also became sterile because of Rav Huna's shir. Rabbi Chelbo iyakim perkei de Rav Huna. Rav Huna really has to shorten the shir. That's the takeaway. It's the takeaway message. Rav Sheshes iyakim perkei de Rav Huna. Again, I will say this. Acharate suskinta. So let's listen to this. So the Gemara tells Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Acharate suskinta. Rabbi said, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says suskinta choli mi otzra shosin va'adam nekar himeno. So apparently he became ill with suskinta. Suskinta apparently is also some type of disease that one gets from holding back their urine. Talyuha ba'arza de beirav. They went out and they suspended him. Apparently, again, the way you deal with this is suspending a person. V'nafak minei kahutza yarka, and he had some type of green emission, and after that green emission, he was cured. Okay. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, shisin sabi havina, the kulam yakem epirkei drafuna. There were 60 men in the shir, and all of them became sterile because of the shir Rav Huna. Lebar me'ana. So what Rav Acha said, Rav Acha bar Yaakov said, except for me, the kaimi ben afshay, because I went ahead and followed the advice. Hachachma techaye ba'aleha. Ultimately, wisdom will go ahead and sustain those who have it. So I will say, so it's not clear exactly what this meant. In other words, how did Rav Acha bar Yaakov avoid this sterility which plagued everyone else? Either it means he went to the bathroom before the shir, or it could also mean that he went to the bathroom during the shir. That he did get up and he left. Whatever it was, it is interesting to see the high rates of sterility in the shir of Rav Huna. Pretty incredible. Says the Gemara, Girsha Muteres. So we'll say, so now we come to an interesting discussion. So remember again, the Mishnah told me that if a couple is married for 10 years, and in the 10-year window they don't have children, the husband is obligated, again, to go ahead and fulfill Perivarivya. So there are two possibilities. Either he could take another wife, or he could divorce his first wife. Let's assume for a moment he divorced. So Reuven and Rachel are married, right? They have no children for 10 years. Reuven divorces Rachel. So the Mishnah says that Rachel is now permitted to go ahead and marry another man, because remember, we do not assume that the sterility is her issue, and she can marry another man. When she marries this other man, she now has what? A new 10-year window. Now, both say the Gemara makes an interesting diuk. Sheni in, shlishi lo. Now, both say, what happens if Rachel marries a second husband? She marries Shimon, another husband, and now another 10 years go by, and she does not have children. So you could infer from the Mishnah that as much as Rachel is permitted to go ahead and marry a second husband, she's not permitted to what? Marry a third husband. Why not, Rabbi saying? So masnisin money Rebbe. Our Mishnah reflects the view of Rebbe, namely that chazaka is established after 2 times. Chazaka is after 2 times. Rabbi say after the second husband and being infertile for 10 years, she now has a chazaka that she is an infertile woman. Now, both say, does that mean she can't get remarried? No. It just means that what? She can't marry a man who has to fulfill the mitzvah perivarivya. So if there's a man who's already fulfilled his mitzvah, that's totally fine. But lamaisa, she would not be permitted to marry a man who still has to fulfill his mitzvah. This Sanya was an interesting case. Mala harishon umeis, sheni umeis, shlishi lo samud Rebbe. We'll say, let's say again, following situation. A couple has a child, right? They circumcise the first child, bris milah, and the child dies from circumcision. Circumcise the second child died from circumcision. So I'll say, so today we know that this is a result of hemophilia, right? In the times of Chazal, obviously we're not, but what we did know is after the second child dies and now they have a third son, we don't give a bris milah to that boy. Right? We don't give a bris milah. Why? Rebbe, because Rebbe holds that chazaka is established after 2 times. Rabbi Gamliel says, no, we would give a bris milah to the third son. So revi'i lo samal, if the third son dies chas v'shalom, then the fourth son, we would not give a bris milah to. So both say machlokes Rebbe or Rabbi Gamliel. Rebbe says chazaka established after 2 times. Rabbi Gamliel says chazaka established after 3 times. Once agavat hanya ipcha. But we learned just the opposite, because we learned Heimi Nayu Achranaisa. Tash, the Gemara says, I'm sorry, but we learned just the opposite. Right? We learned that Rebbe holds 3 times, and Rabbi Gamliel holds, the Rebbe holds 3 times, and Rabbi Gamliel holds 2 times. So Rabbi says, so therefore again says the Gemara, so which one ultimately again is latter? Because also we assume that the latter one is going to be the authoritative one. So says the Gemara, which one is latter? Tashma daran v'chebar abba amra b'yochanan ma'aseh ba'arba chayos b'tzipori shemala rishona umeis shnia umeis shlishish umeis revius. So let's listen to this. There was a case of 4 sisters. Case of 4 sisters in Tzipori. And I will say the following situation happened. Sister number 1 had a son, circumcised him, he died. Sister number 2 had a son, circumcised and he died. Sister number 3 had a son, circumcised and he died. Revi'as baslet Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Ultimately, the 4th sister now had a boy. She comes from Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So Amar le al tamuli. So she said to her, do not go ahead and circumcise her. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel seems to say that chazaka is established after 3 times. Okay, to which the Gemara says, well, don't bring a raya from here. Dilma ki asya shlishis nami hava amar la. So Rabbi say, so if that, Rabbi say, you can't bring a raya from, why can't you bring a raya? They came to ask the shaila at the 4th son. Maybe had they come to ask the shaila at the 3rd son, maybe what? Maybe ultimately would have paskined that way as well. In Cain, my asada said Rabbi Chiya bar Abba. If that's the case, ultimately again, then what's the edus? What is Rabbi Chiya bar Abba really coming to say? V'dilma hakamashlan da'achayos mechaskos. Maybe he's coming to say that halacha l'maisa, sisters create the chazaka. We'll have to stop over here for today. But again, what I just want to point out to you is we're going to end off with this piece that maybe familial chazaka could be established ultimately again through sisters. So for example, we're normally using that familial chazaka is established through one family. Maybe sisters could establish familial chazaka as well. To be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach.